Boomerang Travels in the New Third World, book written by Michael Lewis. Preface The Biggest Shot. This book began accidentally while I was at work on another book about Wall Street and 2008 US financial disaster. I had become interested in a tiny handful of investors who had made their fortunes from the collapse of the subprime mortgage market. Back in 2004, the biggest Wall Street investment banks had created the instrument of their own destruction, the credit default swap on the subprime mortgage bond. The credit default swap enabled investors to bet against the price of any given bond to short it. It was an insurance policy, but with a twist. The buyer needn't own the insured asset. No insurance company can legally sell you fire protection on another person's house, but the financial markets can and will sell you default insurance on another person's investments. Hundreds of investors had dabbled in the credit default swap market. A lot of people had thought, at least in the passing, that the debt-fueled US housing boom was unsustainable, but only 15 or so had gone all in and placed enormous bets that vast tracts of American finance would go up in flames. Most of these people ran hedge funds in London or New York. Most usually avoided journalists. But on this topic, at this moment, they were surprisingly open. All had experienced the strange and isolating sensation of being the sane man in an insane world, and when they talked about their experience, sounded as a person might if he had sat alone in silence in a small boat and watched the Titanic steam into the iceberg. A few of these people were temperamentally ill-suited to solitude and silence. Among this subset was a manager of a hedge fund called Heyman Capital in Dallas, Texas. His name was Kyle Bass. Bass was a native Texan in his late 30s. He had spent the first years of his career, 7 of them at Bear Stearns, selling bonds for Wall Street firms. In late 2006, he had taken half of the $10 million he had saved from his Wall Street career, raised another $500 million from other people, created his hedge fund, and made a massive wager against the subprime mortgage bond market. Then he flown down to New York to warn his old friends that they were on the wrong side of a lot of stupid bets. The traders at Bear Stearns had no interest in what he had to say. "You worry about your risk management, I'll worry about ours," one of them had told him. By the end of 2008, when I went to Dallas to see Bass, the subprime mortgage bond had collapsed, taking Bear Stearns with it. He was now rich and even in investment circles a little famous, but his mind had moved on from the subprime mortgage bond debacle. Having taken his profits, he had a new all-consuming interest: governments. The United States government was just then busy taking on its own books and the subprime loans made by Bear Stearns and other Wall Street banks. The Federal Reserve would wind up absorbing the risk in one form or the another, associated with nearly $2 trillion in dodgy securities. Its actions were of a piece with those of other governments in the rich developed world. The bad loans made by highly paid financiers working in the private sector were being eaten by national treasuries and central banks everywhere. In Kyle Bass's opinion, the financial crisis wasn't over. It was simply being smothered by the full faith and credit of rich Western governments. I spent a day listening to him and his colleagues discuss, almost giddily, where this might lead. They were no longer talking about the collapse of few bonds. They were talking about collapse of entire countries. And they had shiny new investment theses. It ran roughly as follows. From 2002, there had been something like a false boom in much of the rich developed world. What appeared to be economic growth was activity fueled by people borrowing money they probably couldn't afford to repay. By their rough count, worldwide debts, public and private, had more than doubled since 2002, from 84 trillion to 195 trillion. "We never had this kind of accumulation of debt in the world history," says Bass. Critically, the big banks that had extended much of this credit were no longer treated as private enterprises, but as extension of their local governments, sure to be bailed out in a crisis. The public debt of rich countries already stood at what appeared to be dangerously high levels, and in response to the crisis, was rapidly growing. But the public debt of these countries was no longer the official public debt. As a practical matter, it included the debt inside each country's banking system, which in another crisis would be transferred to the government. The first thing we tried to figure out, said Bass, was how big these banking systems were, especially in relation to the government revenues. We took about 4 months to gather the data. No one had it. The numbers added up to astonishing totals. Ireland, for instance, with its largest and growing annual deficits, had amassed debt of more than 25 times its annual tax revenues. Spain and France had accumulated debts of more than 10 times its annual revenues. Historically, such levels of government indebtedness had led to government default. Here's the only way I think things can work out for these countries, Bass said. If they start running real budget surpluses, yeah, and that'll happen right after monkeys fly out of your ass. Still, he wondered if perhaps he was missing something. I went looking for someone, anyone, who knew something about the history of sovereign defaults, he said. He found the leading expert on the subject, a professor at Harvard named Kenneth Rogoff, who, as it happened, was preparing a book on the history of national financial collapse. This time is different, 8 centuries of financial folly, with a fellow scholar, Carmen Reinhardt. We walked Rogoff through the numbers, said Bass, and he just looked at them and sat back in his chair and said, I can hardly believe it is this bad. And I said, wait a minute. You are the world's foremost expert on sovereign balance sheets. You are the go-to guy for sovereign trouble. You taught at Princeton with Ben Bernanke. You introduced Larry Summers to his second wife. You don't know this? Who does? I thought, holy shit, who is paying attention? Thus, his new investment thesis, the subprime mortgage crisis, was more symptom than cause. The deeper social and economic problems that gave rise to it remained. The moment that investors woke up to this reality, they would cease to think of big Western governments as essentially risk-free and demand higher interest rates to lend to them. When the interest rates on their borrowing rose, these governments would plunge further into debt, leading to further rises in the interest rates they were charged to borrow. In a few especially alarming cases, Greece, Ireland, Japan, it wouldn't take much of rise in the interest rates for the budgets to be consumed entirely by interest payments on debt. For example, said Bass, if Japan had to borrow at France rates, the interest burden alone would bankrupt the government. The moment the financial markets realized this, investor sentiment would shift. The moment investor sentiment shifted, these governments would default. And then what? The financial crisis of 2008 was suspended only because investors believed that the governments could borrow whatever they needed to rescue their banks. What happened when the government themselves ceased to be credible? There was another bigger financial crisis waiting to happen. The only question in Kyle Bass's mind was when. At the end of 2008, he thought Greece would probably be the first to go, perhaps triggering a collapse of the euro. He thought it might happen within 2 years. But he didn't have a lot of conviction about his timing. Let's say it takes 5 years and not 2, he said. Let's take it takes 7 years. Should I wait until I see the whites of their eyes before I position myself, or should I position myself now? The answer is now. Because the moment people think it is a possibility, it's expensive. If you wait, you have to pay up for the risk. When we met, he had just bought his first credit default swap on the countries he and his team of analysts viewed as the most likely to be unable to pay off their debts: Greece, Ireland, Italy, Switzerland, Portugal, and Spain. He made these bets directly with the few big Wall Street firms that he felt were least likely to be allowed to fail: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and Morgan Stanley. But doubting their capacity to withstand a more serious crisis, he demanded that they post collateral on the trades every day. The prices he paid for the default insurance on retrospect look absurdly cheap. Greek government default interest cost him 11 basis points, for instance. That is, to insure 1 million of Greek government bonds against the default, Hayman Capital paid a premium of $1,100 a year. Bas guessed that when Greece defaulted, as it inevitably would, the country would be forced to pay down its debts by roughly 70%, which is to say that every $1,100 bet would return $700,000. There is a disbelief that a developed country can default because we have never seen it in our lifetime, said Bas. And it's not in anyone's interest to pay attention to this. Even our own investors. They look at us and say, yeah, you got the subprime right. But you're always out there looking for these extremely rare events. And so you think they happen more often than they do. But I didn't go looking for this position. I was trying to understand the way the world was working. And this time, it came to me. Now that he understood the way the world was working, he continued. He couldn't see how any sane person couldn't do anything but prepare for another bigger financial catastrophe. It may not be the end of the world, he said, but a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money. Our goal is not to be one of them. He was totally persuasive. He was also totally incredible. A guy sitting in an office in Dallas, Texas, making sweeping claims about the future of countries he's hardly set foot in. How on earth could he know how a bunch of people he never met might behave? As he laid out his ideas, I had an experience I have often had while listening to people who seemed to be perfectly certain about uncertain events. One part of me was swept away by his argument and began to worry the world was about to collapse. The other part suspected he might be nuts. That's great, I said, but I was already thinking about the fight I needed to catch. But even if you're right, what can any normal person do about it? He stared at me as if he had just seen an interesting sight. The world's stupidest man. What do you tell your mother when she asks you where to put her money? I asked. Guns and gold, he simply said. Guns and gold, I said. So he was nuts. But not gold futures, he said, paying no attention to my thoughts. You need physical gold. He explained that when the next crisis struck, gold futures market was likely to seize up, as there were more outstanding future contracts than available gold. People who thought they owned gold would find they owned pieces of paper instead. He opened his desk drawer, hauled out a giant gold brick and dropped it on the desk. We've bought a lot of this stuff. At this point, I was giggling nervously and glancing toward the door. The future is a lot harder to predict than people on Wall Street would have you believe. A man who has been as dramatically right about the future as Kyle Bass had been about the subprime market collapse might easily fool himself into thinking he had a talent for being dramatically right about all sorts of other complicated things. At any rate, I was too interested in trying to figure out what had just happened in America to worry much about what was going to happen in the rest of the world, which seemed at that time a trivial matter. And Bas had more or less lost interest in what had just happened in America, because he thought what was about to happen all around the world was so much more important. I made my excuses and took my leave to Dallas, and more or less dismissed him. When I wrote the book, I left Kyle Bass on the cutting room floor. Then financial world began to change again, and very much as Kyle Bass had imagined it might. Entire countries started to go bust. What appeared at first to be a story chiefly about Wall Street became a story that involved every country that came into meaningful contact with Wall Street. I wrote the book about the US subprime mortgage crisis and people who had made a fortune from it, but began to travel to these other places just to see what was up. But I traveled with a nagging question. How did a hedge fund manager in Dallas even think to imagine these strange events? 2.5 years later, in the summer of 2011, I returned to Dallas to ask Kyle Bass that question. Greek credit default swaps were up by 11 basis points to $2,300. Greece was just about to default on its national debt. Ireland and Portugal had required massive bailouts. Spain and Italy had gone from being as essentially riskless to nations on the brink of financial collapse. On top of it, the Japanese Ministry of Finance was about to send a delegation to the United States to tour the big bond investment funds such as PIMCO and BlackRock to see if they could find anyone, willing to buy $500 billion worth of 10-year Japanese government bonds. This is a scenario in which no one alive has ever invested before, Bass said. Our biggest positions now are Japan and France. If and when the dominoes fall, the worst by far is France. I just hope the US doesn't collapse first. All my money is bet that it won't. That's my biggest fear. That I'm wrong about the chronology of events, but I'm convinced what the ultimate outcome is. He still owns stacks of gold and platinum bars that had roughly doubled in value, but he remained on the lookout for hard stores of wealth as a hedge against what he assumed was coming debasement of fiat currency. Nickels, for instance. The value of metal in nickel is worth 6.8 cents. Do you know that? He said. I didn't. I just bought $1 million worth of them, he said. And then perhaps sensing I couldn't do the math, 20 million nickels. You bought 20 million nickels? How do you buy 20 million nickels? Actually, it's very difficult, he said. And then explained that he had to call his bank and talk them into ordering him 20 million nickels. The bank had finally done it, but the Federal Reserve has its own questions. The Fed apparently called my guy at the bank, he says. They asked him, why do you want all these nickels? So he called me and asked, why do you want all these nickels? And I said, I just like nickels. He pulled out a photograph of his nickels and handed it to me. There they were, piled up on a giant wooden pallet in a Brinks vault in downtown Dallas. I'm telling you, in the next 2 years, they'll change the content of the nickel. He said, you really ought to call your bank and buy some now. I doubt Kyle Bass ever the sort of person who enjoyed sitting around an office and staring at a computer screen. He enjoys the unsettled life. We hopped into his Hummer, decorated with bumper stickers. God bless our troops, especially our snipers. And customized to maximize the amount of fun its owner could have in it. For instance, he could press a button and James Bond like the coat the road behind him in giant tracks. We roared into the Texas Hill Country, where, with the fortune he made off the subprime prices, Kyle Bass had purchased what amounted to a fort, a 40,000 square foot ranch house on thousands of acres in the middle of nowhere, with its own water supply and an arsenal of automatic weapons and sniper rifles and small explosives to equip a battalion. That night we tore into his property in the back of his US Army Jeep, firing the very latest issue US Army sniper rifles, equipped with infrared scopes at the beavers that he felt were a menace to his waterways. There are these explosives you can buy on the internet, he said, as we bounded over the yellow hills. It's a molecular reaction. FedEx will deliver hundreds of pounds of these things. A few beavers that survived the initial night rifle assault would wake up to watch their dams being more or less vaporized. It doesn't exactly sound like a fair fight, I said. Beavers are rodents, he said. Whatever else he was doing, he was clearly having fun. He spent 2.5 years watching the global financial system and the people who ran it confirm his dark view of them. It didn't get to him. It thrilled him to have gotten his mind around seemingly incomprehensible events. I am not someone who is hell-bent on being negative his whole life, he said. I think there is something we need to go through. It's atonement. It's atonement for the sins of the past. Once again, a hedge fund manager had been more or less right, and the world had been more or less wrong. Now seemed as a good time as any to pose the question that had nagged me for more than 2 years. Here you are, I said, in so many words, an essentially provincial hedge fund manager in Dallas, Texas. whose entire life has been lived within a few miles of this place. You speak no foreign languages. You seldom travel abroad. You're deeply patriotic. Your biggest philanthropic cause is wounded veterans. You hardly know anyone who isn't American. How did it even occur to you to start spinning theories about financial future of these distant countries? It was Iceland that got to me, he said. I've always been interested in Iceland. But why? Did you ever play Risk as a kid? He asked. I love playing Risk, and I'd always put all of my armies on Iceland because you could attack anybody from there. The belief that he could attack anyone from Iceland had led Kyle Bass to learn whatever he could about Iceland and to pay special attention when something happened in Iceland. He found out, for instance, that Iceland was held up by geographers as an example of a country with special talent for survival against long environmental odds. We kept saying these banks are out of business, but the government kept saving the banks, he said. And right in the midst of this, Iceland went broke. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. How after 1,000 years of getting things right and overcoming all natural obstacles, did they get it so wrong? I had my answer. His interest had started with a board game. It was ending with another kind of board game. And Iceland was once again a good place to start.